Good afternoon, or good evening, depends on when you're watching this, I guess, or maybe good morning. Welcome to uh, another exciting episode of U.S. History to the Present. Our discussion today is in one of the most, how can I put it, most infamous moments in American history, or at least one that Americans would like to forget. Possibly the best way to say it is one of the most regrettable moments in American history. At least that is the common perception of the Vietnam War that the United States was involved in really from 1955 to almost 1975, although we were officially out before that. In this first picture, or this first slide, I have a picture of Ho Chi Minh, the leader of Vietnam, the leader of the Viet Minh movement, or uh, revolutionary movement that was first opposed to ending French colonial rule over Vietnam, and then was the leader of the North Vietnamese state that was the mastermind of the North Vietnamese effort to reunite the country under the communist rule of North Vietnam. And I say it was a successful one, although he did not live to see the end. It's important to note that Ho Chi Minh greatly admired the United States, although he was a devout communist. Story is that he actually sought an audience with Woodrow Wilson in 1918 when Wilson was in Paris at Versailles negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, but Wilson did not give him an audience at that time. He had been impressed with Wilson's support of anti colonialism and of the right of national self determination. Ho Chi Minh also admired the grand strategy of George Washington in the Revolutionary War. How do you defeat a much more powerful country if you are a small country with fewer resources and a smaller population? Well, George Washington practiced a strategy of attrition. You prolong the war and never give your enemy a sure chance of victory because you avoid having your army destroyed and you eventually wear down their will to fight. And you get them so that they're tired of fighting any longer. Ho Chi Minh understood this very well. In 1945, at the end of World War II, he said, "If we have to fight, we will fight. You will kill 10 of our men, and we will kill one of yours. And in the end, it will be you that tire." That would be an apt description of the Vietnamese insurrection against French colonial rule. And it would be an apt description of the successful war that the North fought against the United States that ultimately ended up with the North triumphing and uniting both sections of the country under the rule of communism. But as I said, Ho Chi Minh admired the United States. In many ways, this is a war that is filled with irony. How did the United States get involved in this war? Let me just start out by saying that in 1941, the United States slapped an oil embargo on the Japanese because they had occupied French Indochina. This was not because we were great advocates of colonialism, just the opposite. The United States had refused to defend any other country's colonies. We were opposed to colonialism for the most part, and although we owned some colonies of our own, the assumption was that the United States would eventually free them, which we did with the Philippines in the aftermath of World War II, when they were, quote unquote, ready to govern themselves. When the Japanese were defeated in World War II, the United States celebrated, together with Vietnam, its independence. And Ho Chi Minh read from the Declaration of Independence while Americans watched and celebrated alongside. The last thing the United States expected in 1945 was to end up in a war with Ho Chi Minh. But things changed swiftly. By 1947, the United States was fully engaged in a Cold War with the Soviet Union. China, shortly after that, became a communist country. We ended up fighting the Korean War. Most importantly, in our Cold War, we needed the help of the French. One of the most important strategic components in America's response to Soviet aggression and Soviet attempts to spread communism around the world was the creation of NATO. After World War II, the French came back into Vietnam and reimposed their colonial rule over Vietnam. The Viet Minh, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, fought back. And as a consequence, when the United States asked NATO, or asked France to join NATO, their bargaining chip was, we need your help against Ho Chi Minh. And after all, he's a communist. This is a communist revolution. And the United States, it left Truman with a bad taste in his mouth. But as a consequence, Truman agreed, and we began to subsidize the French effort to crush the insurgency in French Indochina. And so the purpose of this lecture then, from this point on, is to survey the course of the American involvement in the conflict from the 1950s through the downfall of South Vietnam and its abandonment by the U.S. Congress. Notice I said the U.S. Congress. And ultimately to critically assess the strategies and policies pursued by the U.S. during the various presidential administrations. And I should add, the legacy of the war. Now, as I already pointed out to you, that we supported the Vietnamese during World War II, but the real turning point in our relations in Vietnam was the French demand that we support them in their efforts to crush the rebellion in their colony in French Indochina. The United States acquiesced and agreed to do so, and from that point on, we were France's partner in subduing, or in their futile and unsuccessful attempts to quell the rebellion in their colony in French Indochina. French attempts to stop this rebellion led directly to the decisive and final battle in this colonial war. In 1954, Viet Minh troops assaulted the French fort at Dien Bien Phu. The French were sure at first they could hold on, but as time went on and more Vietnamese troops arrived and surrounded the fort, it became evident that the French could not survive without help. I will come back to this in my next slide, but I'll bring it up now. The French desperately asked Eisenhower if he would provide American air support for the beleaguered and desperate French garrison at Dien Dien Bien Phu. Eisenhower absolutely refused. Under numerous pleas, he absolutely told the French that he would not provide American help, military help of any sort, to save French Indochina from the insurgents. Consequently, the garrison fell, and the French sued for peace. And shortly afterwards, at Geneva, the French agreed to withdraw. It was also agreed by the signatories there that Vietnam would be divided into North and South Vietnam temporarily until there were free elections, something that the United States would normally approve of. However, the United States did not, first of all, was not a signatory at this accord, and secondly, the United States refused to accept the terms of the accord, largely because they believed by this point that the elections would not be free in Vietnam. Instead, they were willing to go another course. Of course, by this, as I had already pointed out to you, by this time, Truman is no longer president, and Eisenhower is president. And also, as I've already pointed out, Eisenhower had refused to order air support for the French at Dien Bien Phu. If you remember from my last lecture on Eisenhower, Eisenhower was committed to the New Look strategy. And a part of that New Look strategy was simply no more Koreas. And Eisenhower saw Vietnam as a new Korea, an Asian war that would engulf us, and one that would be unlikely that we could win. A popular theory in the Cold War was the domino theory. Certainly, John Kennedy believed in the domino theory. He believed that Vietnam was the cornerstone in a free Southeast Asia. But if Vietnam fell to the communists, then all of the South or Southeast Asia would become communist, and freedom would be wiped out there. Eisenhower, in public, strongly promoted and defended the domino theory. But in his private talks, in his own councils and with his cabinet, he showed skepticism and pessimism about the validity of this theory. He was not convinced that if Vietnam fell, that all of Southeast Asia would go with it. Eisenhower did not favor the United States becoming involved in a grand military way, nor did he favor the United States becoming involved unilaterally in Vietnam. What he favored was collective action, and not as aggressive action, but as a deterrent. What Eisenhower wanted to keep at bay was Communist China and Soviet Union. And he believed the best way for that to happen and to prevent America from becoming bogged down in a colonial war in the Far East was for the United States to form a treaty alliance, much like NATO. NATO was the blueprint for what would be called CETO. CETO included the United Kingdom, France, Australia, New Zealand, Pakistan, Thailand, and it put South Vietnam under its protection. So this way, Eisenhower believed he could avoid another Korea. But that doesn't mean that he wasn't willing to help Vietnam. And he did not want to see, and the United States refused to go along with free elections because he did not believe they would be free, and probably rightfully so. Because, as we will talk about in a second, the North had left a cadre of communists to undermine any government and to intimidate the people of South Vietnam into supporting a united communist country. What Eisenhower favored instead was it became known as the Saigon military mission. Saigon military mission was an example of Eisenhower's alternative to conventional military engagement or nuclear war. You might remember from my lecture on the New Look that if it was worth our time, Eisenhower favored a nuclear response because the United States had overwhelming nuclear superiority. He believed that conventional forces would ultimately become very costly. He wanted to cut the defense budget and maintain prosperity in the United States. And he also believed that, honestly, the United States could not compete with the Soviet and conventional forces or with China. He had concluded that with conventional forces, the war in South Korea could not be won, which is why he, through diplomatic channels, threatened nuclear action. It's also why he threatened to use nuclear weapons against China over islands off the coast of Taiwan. If it wasn't worth going to a nuclear war or threatening nuclear war, then Eisenhower really was not in favor of using conventional weapons at all. He would use them in Europe, in places that were vital, absolutely vital to American defense, but he would not use them in places like Vietnam. What he favored was then covert action, covert operations by the CIA. And the Saigon military mission was very much a combination of military advisors and covert CIA operatives to ultimately undermine the cadre of Viet Minh who had remained in the South, estimated at 5,000, and later known as the Viet Cong, and in support to do this to help train and advise the military of the Ngo Dinh Diem regime in their war against communism. And so the Eisenhower was willing to go that far to stop the organization that became known as the Viet Cong. Now, the Diem regime was a problem in its own right. Ngo Dinh Diem ran his government like a medieval feudal court. And in fact, he was a titular head for all practical purposes. He allowed his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, to be the power behind the throne. The trouble with that was his brother was corrupt and he was brutal. He ran an extensive system of extortion, payoffs, influence peddling through a secret network called the Can Lao. The conduct of this organization, the brutality of this regime, and its Catholicism offended the local people, who were mostly Buddhists. This, in turn, provided an opportunity for the communists to expand their influence, and by 1957, the Viet Cong had become much stronger than they were in 1955. And consequently, they began a campaign of terrorism and assassination against agents of the government. By the spring of 1959, the Viet Cong were strong enough to take on the army of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnamese Army. And they had also by this time demonstrated that they were worthy of support from the North Vietnamese government, communist government in the north. And they received the outright endorsement of the North Vietnamese communist regime. The North began to train Southerners in the North who were the North began to train Southerners in the North, equip them, and then infiltrate them back into the South. The Viet Cong had even infiltrated the higher ranks of the South Vietnamese army. By 1959, Viet Cong attacks and ambushes averaged 100 a month. In 1960, the Viet Cong assassinated 2,500 government officials. Eisenhower's covert actions, his support of the Vietnamese government, was at jeopardy. But Eisenhower was about to step down from office and turn the office of the presidency over to John F. Kennedy. We don't know what would have happened if Eisenhower had remained in office. He had served his 2 terms. His time was up. We don't know. We could guess, and I would guess, but it would be counterfactual history, that Eisenhower would have found a way of avoiding the kind of involvement that Kennedy would get the United States into. And that's because of his commitment to no more Koreas, his commitment to use nuclear weapons if something was necessary or strategically vital to the United States. But as I've suggested, Eisenhower privately did not believe the domino theory, and it's unlikely that he would have used force for something that he believed was not vital to U.S. interests. But Eisenhower was no longer president. And when Kennedy was inaugurated, it was time for Kennedy to implement his plan to replace the new look with a more flexible response policy. Vietnam would become the centerpiece of Kennedy's failed flexible response policy. The mastermind of flexible response was a gentleman by the name of Bernard Brodie. He had made a name for himself as a grand strategist. He had worked at the Naval War College. He had written numerous books. He started out as a naval strategist, but with the age of the nuclear warhead now present, Brodie turned his attention to fleshing out the details of a nuclear strategy. At first, Brodie agreed pretty much with Eisenhower. He was in favor of a first strike nuclear arsenal that would allow the United States to target the enemy and destroy their weapons on the ground. But by the time we reach the end of the 1950s, Brodie had changed his mind. And he had written a book called Strategy in the Missile Age. And in that book, he rejected the new look and advocated a flexible response. which would call for an escalating response to aggression, beginning with the use of conventional weapons first. And once conventional weapons had been exhausted or had been unable to stop the tide of the enemy, then the U.S. would turn to tactical nukes next. You can begin to understand why this was called a more flexible response, because really Eisenhower's was either or. Finally, if all else failed, the last resort would be strategic nukes. In fairness to Brodie, he favored still targeting enemy silos and enemy nuclear installations rather than cities. And so that is really where he went with it. In conjunction with this, once Kennedy became president and is influenced by the strategy of Bernard Brodie, these recommendations are reinforced by a report put out by economist Walter Rostow and Army Chief of Staff Maxwell Taylor. In their report in 1961, they recommended that the United States increased its military assistance to Vietnam, primarily in the form of military hardware, specifically helicopters and armored personnel carriers. At the same time, they recommended that the United States increase its military advisors. Kennedy did not want to have the cornerstone that held up all the other dominoes in the Far East to fall to the North Vietnamese, to communism. As a consequence and as a result of the Kennedy administration's commitment to flexible response and to the Rostow and Maxwell Taylor report, by 1962, the Kennedy administration had sent 9,000 advisors to Vietnam. Now, I want to put this in perspective for you, because when Eisenhower left office in 1961, there were only 900 military advisors in Vietnam. But by 1962, Kennedy had expanded this to 9,000. And by the time of Kennedy's assassination, there were 17,000 American advisors in Vietnam. Unfortunately, that the United States was fighting a war against the population, because the Diem government was becoming extremely unpopular, which was fueling the successes of the communist insurrection in the South. As a consequence, Kennedy, shortly before his death, reluctantly sanctioned a military coup. At least the United States agreed not to interfere. And the military overthrew the Diem regime and took control itself. Long story short, eventually this would be lead to the rise of the Thieu regime, THIEU. In this coup, there was no mercy. It was a brutal coup. The NGOs, Diem and his brother and his sister were all captured and murdered by the army. What Kennedy would have done about all of this in the aftermath, it's hard to know. He was committed to flexible response, and he had committed the United States to flexible response. His brother, Bob Kennedy, absolutely believed that Kennedy would not have given up on Vietnam, that it would be a matter of winning, in Robert's words. But it didn't matter, because 3 weeks after the military overthrew the Diem regime, Kennedy himself was dead, assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald in Dallas, Texas. Almost immediately after Kennedy's assassination, his vice president, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was inaugurated as president and took the oath of office. Johnson, in the words of Ronald Spector, left a legacy of indecision, half measures, and gradually increasing involvement. That was Johnson's legacy in the Vietnam War. Of course, he was helped in this because he inherited Kennedy's advisors. And what Johnson really did, in a halfway manner, because the last thing that Johnson wanted to do was find himself involved in a war. Johnson was more interested in his social policies, which became known as the Great Society. He shared Kennedy's enthusiasm for expanding the New Deal and the Fair Deal. As a consequence, Johnson was more concerned about a legacy like Medicare and the war on poverty than he was getting involved in a Far Eastern war. But he had an administration that was committed to the new flexible response policy of his predecessor, John F. Kennedy. But because Johnson was unenthusiastic and bothered by the very fact that he had to deal with this, meant that the way he handled the war was indecisively, with half measures, but yet at the same time, a gradually increasing involvement without really any direction. The crisis came on August 2nd, 1964. And then a couple of days later, the fire was fueled. American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, which you can see in this map here to your on the right side of your screen, were a destroyer, the USS Maddox, on the August 2nd was attacked, allegedly by, and probably was attacked by, North Vietnamese patrol boats. They were unsuccessful in their attack. There was no damage done of any significance, but the fact that they had attacked gave Johnson ammunition. And really, he felt he couldn't look the other way. How far this would have gone is a good question. But on a couple nights later, the USS Maddox had been joined by the USS Turner Joy, and as a consequence, again they were allegedly attacked. Although this time, it's very questionable, and even the commander of the USS Turner Joy questioned whether there had been an attack or whether this was some sort of radar malfunction of some sort. But needless to say, this gave Lyndon Johnson the ammunition he needed to go to Congress and request a resolution to authorize his involvement in Vietnam. And as a consequence, Congress gave him the resolution he desired, which authorized him to use whatever force was necessary to protect American forces in Vietnam. Immediately, Johnson ordered airstrikes against Viet Cong bases and against the North's naval bases in North Vietnam. The communists responded by targeting our air bases. And since we had no military support other than the Vietnamese army, South Vietnamese army, this threatened our air bases and our air forces in South Vietnam. Since Johnson had the Gulf of Tonkin resolution fresh from Congress, which, by the way, there are only 2 members of Congress voted against it, Johnson ordered 100,000 troops to support and defend our Air Force in Vietnam. Put this in perspective, by the time that Johnson left office, there were between 500,000 and 550,000 U.S. troops were serving in Vietnam. This was the beginning of the great escalation of the war. In fairness, even to Kennedy, what Johnson did far exceeded either of his predecessors. However, the United States was very committed with its 17,000 there. It was enough that it would be difficult for the United States to look the other way. How would the United States fight the war? That was a good question. Actually, the United States envisioned this primarily as an air war, that the way the United States would originally and initially defend the South was with our troops protecting our airfields, the continual training of the South Vietnamese forces, and our airstrikes against the North. There was a strategic disagreement at the highest levels of the American government. And that was extremely important in understanding how this war evolved and developed, because the Joint Chiefs of Staff strongly encouraged their best advice to Johnson was for Johnson to authorize military attacks against Haiphong and Hanoi. If you look at the map here on the right, you will see the 2 ways that the North supplied the North Viet Cong and their own forces in the South, which by this time they had a substantial number. First way was from Haiphong, which was also the way that the North got supplies, military hardware from China and from Russia. If Haiphong Harbor was inoperable, if it had been incapacitated by bombings, that would cut off this supply route right here, which actually went around to this port right here in Cambodia. That's right. The same time that the North was violating the integrity and sovereignty of South Vietnam, they had established bases and built a road of their own from this Cambodian port. The leader of Cambodia could not stop this. It was an irritant, but he could do nothing about it. He didn't have the forces to do anything about it. So the Joint Chiefs said, this is what we need to do to win the war. Yeah, it's fine. You want to bomb the other direction was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. You can bomb that trail if you want, but it will be very difficult for us to actually do any serious damage to the Vietnamese. If you really want to hurt the North Vietnamese war effort, what you need to do is take out their industrial capacity, their transportation system, and prevent the import of any military hardware or the output of any military hardware from the Haiphong harbor. In a nutshell, the major industrial and transportational hub in North Vietnam was Hanoi. And the commercial center, the most important port in Vietnam, North Vietnam, was Haiphong. Those were the two strategic centers of gravity, the two great vulnerabilities. And the Joint Chiefs accurately pinpointed those as the proper targets. Johnson feared getting into a war with China or Russia. He wanted to keep them out of the war, and he feared that a Russian ship sitting in Haiphong harbor may become the inadvertent target of American bombs dropped on the harbor. The Joint Chiefs also recommended mining the harbor so that ships could not go in or go out. The chiefs believed that these two measures would successfully interdict any attempts by the North to reinforce the South. I am going to tell you this, and we're going to come back to this later on, because oftentimes when you read about the Vietnam War, Americans are told by their teachers, by the press, that the Vietnam War was not a winnable war. Now, whether it's winnable or not is not the same as asking whether it was moral or not. That's another issue. But the reality is that I think that is fallacious to say that the Vietnam War was unwinnable. Oftentimes, wars are lost because of poor strategy. The side with the bigger battalions does not always win a war. The British could not defeat George Washington. And as a consequence, they ended up acknowledging and agreeing to our independence because they followed and pursued a poor strategy to defeat the United States revolutionary effort. At this lecture, I am one of the things that I'm coming to, and this is my analysis, is just that Johnson made a fatal error not listening to the Joint Chiefs. That the Vietnam War was a winnable war, and that Johnson failed to take advantage of his greatest opportunity to win the war. As we go through this, you will see that there is merit in what I say. The next big event in the Vietnam War was what's called the Tet Offensive. Tet was the Lunar New Year festival. And the North planned a surprise attack on the South in January of 1968. As the new year came, the North intended to put forth a full-fledged effort to bring about a insurgency in the South, sponsored by the Viet Cong and supported by the North Vietnamese Army. They would strike at all the major cities in the South with the expectation that the people would rise up against the South Vietnamese government, and the South Vietnamese army would collapse. And whether they won or not, they would occupy enough cities that would cause the United States to give up its effort. In January of 1968, they targeted more than 200 cities in the South. The Tet Offensive was a total disaster for the North Vietnamese army and for the Viet Cong. The communists had committed 80,000 troops to the offensive, and at least half of them were casualties. This is because the United States and the South Vietnamese were not caught off guard. Yes, initially the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong made inroads, and they had some minor successes, but they failed to achieve any of their objects, and it was in the end an abject failure. On the other hand, both the Americans and the South Vietnamese forces acquitted themselves well. In fact, the North followed this up with another attack a few months later, and they lost another 50,000 men. And by the time these two failures were done, for all practical purposes, the North Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army in the South were unable to launch any significant offensive operations in the South for over 2 years. General Westmoreland, who was in charge of our Vietnam operations at that time, immediately requested 206,000 more U.S. troops to decisively crush once and for all the North's efforts in the South. That was his estimate. All through the war, every time Westmoreland said, "I need troops," Johnson would never give him what he asked for. In this case, he gave him 20,000 more troops, and that was it. And yet, the United States, because of the failure of the Tet Offensive, had the North up against the ropes and had the Viet Cong up against the ropes. Had both up against the ropes. The United States was in a position to win the war at this point in time. Unfortunately, Johnson lost his nerve or his will, and in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, he announced the unilateral end of U.S. bombing strikes against the North and called for peace talks with the North to determine the terms of an American withdrawal from the war. The truth of the matter is that the American press had made the war look like an American, the Tet Offensive looked like an American defeat, rather than what it was, crushing, overwhelming American victory. The American press acted like a fifth guard within our own country, with the help of the anti-war movement. Now, I say this with some chagrin and humility, because at that point in my life, I opposed the war in Vietnam. I'm not saying I'm supportive of it right now, or think that as a historian that it was the right thing. Again, I say, whether it was a moral war or a winnable war, those are not the same thing. But the reality is that the American people were deceived by their own press. And they were deceived by a anti-war movement that did not have an accurate picture of what was really happening. As military historian Alan Millett put it, Johnson snatched defeat from the jaws of victory. As I said, he did this by announcing the unilateral end of U.S. bombing strikes against the North and calling for peace talks with the North to determine the terms of an American withdrawal from the war. In other words, it sounded like he was ready to announce defeat. Johnson was so beleaguered that he also announced that he would not run for president for a second term. And this led to an extremely important and significant divide in the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party had been the internationalist party originally. Remember, it was Woodrow Wilson who called on the United States to take a position of leadership in world affairs. And it was the Republicans in the Senate that blocked the Treaty of Versailles from being ratified. And as late as the Truman administration, Republicans in Congress, led by Robert Taft, were in favor of a more isolationist stance by the United States, did not want us to become involved in places like Vietnam. The first step in this change took place with Eisenhower, because Eisenhower was an internationalist Republican, as was his vice president, Richard Nixon. Both represented a change in the Republican Party from a more isolationist stance to a more internationalist stance. But it was the Democrats, Wilson, Roosevelt, Truman, who had originally stood for a greater American involvement in world affairs. It was Roosevelt who envisioned the United Nations. It was Roosevelt who envisioned collective defense and security and replacing the balance of power politics with a concert of power politics, with the United States taking the lead. But in the aftermath of the Tet Offensive, and in the aftermath of Johnson's announcement that he would not run, the Democratic Party was split. Always a political opportunist, Robert Kennedy took an anti-war stance, which ultimately forced Hubert Humphrey, his opponent, who originally was still in favor of American involvement, to move further to the left and follow Kennedy's lead. This is the beginning of the Democratic takeover, the Democratic Party's takeover by the New Left. Now, the New Left is not like the old left. You will hear extremely conservative Americans say that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was a commie or a socialist. No, even though I think the New Deal was a failure on a lot of levels, Roosevelt's primary purpose was to save capitalism. He was a rather conservative man. And Truman likewise. The Democratic Party was committed to market capitalism, albeit more regulated than the Republican Party was. These two parties were not that far apart. And I want to make that point. Eisenhower did not try to dismantle the New Deal. He just wanted to slow its growth. And so we see that Republicans and Democrats are not that far apart. And the Republican Party at this point in time was the party of many of the northern states. When I was a young man, our governor was a Republican, Nelson Rockefeller, who embraced much of what the New Deal stood for. So when we begin to understand this, this is a sea change in American politics, because the Democratic Party is split. And this is really the beginning of the conservative Republican resurgence. From 1932 till 1964, the Democratic Party, except for Eisenhower, dominated American politics. Before that, the Republican Party had dominated American politics. Watergate ultimately aborted this revolution, but the election of 1968 was the beginning of the conservative ascendancy, and what I would rightly call a little later on in my lecture, the age of Reagan. And I will come back to that theme later. But this split and the Democratic Party was such that it lost its majority. Secondly, the civil rights movement also divided the Democratic Party because Johnson had come out fully in favor of civil rights, and the Civil Rights Acts were passed as a part of the Great Society and are a part of Johnson's legacy. Today, the dominant party in the South is the Republican Party. The Republican Party adopted a states' rights position which appealed to the Dixiecrats who joined the Republican Party in mass. The new morals of the new left offended one of the most important constituencies of the Democratic Party, Roman Catholics, Italian Catholics, Polish Catholics who had always voted Democrat began to vote Republican. And with the decision that is known as Roe v. Wade that made abortion legal across the country, ultimately would strengthen this. Nixon called his new coalition the silent majority, a more conservative majority. And this division has been the making of the two political parties ever since. And the Democrats really haven't, except for Obama and Clinton, haven't really been able to respond to this. And largely because once the new left got its grip on the Democratic Party, it keeps pushing it further and further to the left, which leads to the more centrist independents and even Democrats moving over to the Republican Party, so that a moderate like George W. Bush could win election twice. And even Trump could win. I will leave it at that. And this is where we go with this little discussion. It leads to the ascension of Richard Nixon as president of the United States. Nixon lost the election to Kennedy in 1960. In 1962, he ran for governor of California and was defeated. And he blamed the press, and he said, he had a press conference, and he said, "You won't have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore." It appeared like Nixon was done with politics. But behind the scenes, he was supporting other Republicans. And when Goldwater got shellacked by Johnson in the 1964 election, Nixon was waiting for the opportunity to become the heir apparent to the Republican throne. He built this coalition that I've shared, known many ways, but probably best as the silent majority, those who may not have spoken out, weren't as vocal as the anti-war movement, but still maintained traditional American values, hated communism, and were determined to fight the Cold War to the utmost degree if necessary. Nixon, though, knew that the Vietnam War had become unpopular. Americans abhorred the protests, but at the same time, behind the scenes, they were becoming sick of the war. Ho Chi Minh's strategy was paying off. So Nixon came into office. He had promised an honorable peace, to a certain degree, taking a play from Eisenhower's playbook. We will see if he was as successful as Eisenhower. The elements of his quest for an honorable peace began with détente. Détente was based on the assumption that Russia and China were becoming rivals in the communist world, and were also at odds with each other over the sphere of influence, their sphere of influence in Central Asia, particular Mongolia, excuse me. Leonid Brezhnev, the Russian premier, had actually suggested to the United States that the Soviet Union and the United States carry out joint nuclear strikes against China if they became too strong. The Americans were happy to take advantage of this. Nixon was happy to take advantage of this because during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, the United States' military position in the world had declined due to our absorption in the Vietnam War. As I've suggested to you, our defense budget was swallowed up in waging a war against Vietnam. Meanwhile, the Russians were building up their navy and their nuclear force. And so, as a consequence, Nixon concluded, I don't know if rightfully so, because I think our best years were ahead of us, that the United States was no longer the absolutely supreme superpower, that it would be best for us to pit China and Russia against each other. And his master of ceremonies in this was his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, who was also his chief foreign policy advisor. Kissinger believed it was time to play the China card and pit both red powers against each other, and at the same time improve relations with both to our advantage and as a means to encourage them to stay out of our way in Vietnam. If we could do that, we could isolate Vietnam, and that would give us a freer hand in dealing with North Vietnam and bringing them to the peace table with terms that we could accept and could allow us to escape the grasp of the war with honor, quote unquote. Second part of Nixon's quest for an honorable peace was Vietnamization. And this would essentially be building up the South Vietnamese armed forces and decreasing our armed forces. The United States would equip and train a 1 million man part-time army, the People's Self-Defense Force, and would increase the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, the South Vietnamese Army, by 100,000 men. On the other hand, Nixon would begin reducing American forces there, beginning with a 150,000 man reduction. Third, the United States would still continue to carry out the war, especially with an emphasis on interdicting supplies through Cambodia. The United States had developed new technology that would allow them to see the heat signatures of North Vietnamese Army trucks and vehicles along the Ho Chi Minh Trail. And so with that in mind, they used helicopters, smaller aircraft, as well as B-52s to target the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they would know when convoys were going through and destroy them. But this strategy ran immediately into trouble because the North Vietnamese Army controlled the countryside of Cambodia, as I said before, and the major seaport of Sihanoukville. They maintained military and supply bases in the jungles of Cambodia in order to supply the insurgency in Vietnam. Nixon recognized Commando Hunt would not stop the NVA supply chain, so he launched military incursions into Cambodia secretly without congressional approval. And he launched B-52 bombing missions against NVA's supply bases in Cambodia with the blessings of the Cambodian government. As I think I pointed out earlier, from Sihanoukville, the North Vietnamese Army had built a road that met the Ho Chi Minh Trail and then entered into South Vietnam. The goal was to destroy this means of supply. Unfortunately for Nixon And for this program, and maybe fortunately for the United States, this secret operation, which was done without congressional approval, was revealed in the pages of the New York Times. It was an embarrassment to Nixon, and it turned the American people even further against the war, and it encouraged the anti-war movement in the United States. By this time, a poll in America revealed that 71% of the American people believed that the U.S. had made a mistake in sending troops to Vietnam, and 58% believed it was an immoral war. So here is a really important point to understand. There probably at this point isn't any way the United States wins the war in Vietnam. Well, maybe there's a way, but the bottom line is that Ho Chi Minh has won. Thanks to the press, thanks to the anti-war movement, thanks to the war weariness and the failure of flexible response, because you have to question the wisdom of being involved there to the degree we were involved in the first place. This war had become extremely unpopular. And even though Nixon had the support of the silent majority, that didn't mean they supported him in an all-out war in Vietnam. Nixon's back was against the wall, and the best he could hope for was a way out that appeared to leave the United States with some shred of honor. The North Vietnamese helped him in this by launching an offensive in March of 1972 called the Easter Offensive, because it began at Easter time in 1972 into the South. This was a full-scale operation, and it was meant to, once and for all, finish off the South Vietnamese army. The South Vietnamese army took some terrible hits and suffered severe damage. But the United States' response to this was a full-scale air assault on North Vietnam called Operation Linebacker. Operation Linebacker was aimed at the North Vietnamese transportation system, not the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but the transportation system in the north. And it targeted Haiphong Harbor. Consequence was imports were reduced to 80%, and the transportation system was paralyzed. And it exhausted the North Vietnam's air defenses. So if the United States attacked again, North Vietnam would be helpless to resist any American attacks. It was costly for the United States. We lost 114 aircraft, but it did what it needed to do. Two things Nixon hoped that it would accomplish. First of all, it would bring an end to the Easter Offensive, which it did. The offensive in the South ground to a halt because they had no military hardware, they had no fuel, they had no supplies. It had successfully stopped the North's assault in the South to a complete halt. The second thing it did is it brought the North Vietnamese back to the peace table. And an agreement was reached in principle. An agreement that was favorable to the South, or to North Vietnam. The U.S. would withdraw from the North or from South Vietnam. We would agree to do so. We were involved in doing so anyway. But the North would not insist on the demise of the two government. It would not insist on that demand. The problem is that the United States did not involve the two government, the South Vietnamese government, in these peace talks. And when they presented this to the two government, the South Vietnamese were angered and refused to go along with it. Consequently, the United States went back to the peace table, and the North Vietnamese were angered and they refused to return. They left and they refused, and the agreement and the initial attempt to end the war had come to a halt. Nixon was not angry with the South. Instead, he was angry with the North, and he launched Linebacker 2, which would inflict even more damage because the North no longer had any real air defenses left. Linebacker 2 focused on Hanoi and Haiphong. It was executed with 1,800 sorties over the North, 20,000 tons of bombs. The U.S. only lost 15 B-52s and 11 other planes. On the other hand, the industrial capacity of North Vietnam was destroyed, and Haiphong Harbor became useless as a port of entry. Détente contributed to the success because neither the Chinese nor the Soviet Union intervened or lifted a finger to help the Hanoi government. Afterwards, the North Vietnamese government agreed to return to the peace table, and an agreement was made. The U.S. would withdraw. The North Vietnam would not insist on replacing the two government, and the U.S. would give the South Vietnamese government, the two government, a promise that we would return if necessary, and we agreed to get the South Vietnamese to go along with this, that we would sweeten the pot with an abundance of American military equipment. And so Nixon had gained, quote unquote, an honorable peace. This was on January 27th, 1973. Was it an honorable peace? Well, I would argue that it could have been, but we don't know. Because what happened next was that Richard Nixon became embroiled in a scandal that brought down his presidency. During 1972, some of his henchmen, without his personal knowledge, broke into the Watergate Hotel, where the Democratic campaign headquarters was located in Washington, D.C., and bugged the headquarters. As I said, there's no evidence that Nixon was aware of this, and he was shocked and angered when he found out. Unfortunately for Richard Nixon, he responded in the wrong way. Nixon did have a paranoid streak, and that paranoid streak was reinforced by the way he had been treated by the press, and consequently, he exaggerated the problem, and instead of coming clean and basically hanging out his henchmen to dry, delivering them over to Congress and to the courts, Nixon tried to cover it up. Short story for the moment, because I don't want to go too far into it, is it was the end of the Nixon administration. As more and more details were revealed, and the fact that Nixon had abused his power, obstructed justice, tampered with evidence, all high crimes and misdemeanors, Nixon was forced, before he was impeached, to resign from his presidency in disgrace. And he was replaced by Gerald Ford. I will not say that Gerald Ford was one of the strongest men who occupied the office of president. So what happens next is simply any chance for an honorable peace comes to an end. Congress passes the War Powers Act, which prevents the United States, the president, from getting us involved in a war without Congress's approval. An understandable reform. And when the North launches an assault on the South, Congress refuses to give support that had been promised to the South Vietnamese government. Ford is president, and since Congress is unwilling to support the support the South with American air support, nothing comes from the United States. The South Vietnamese army quickly collapses. Actually, the North thought that it would take 2 years to win this campaign. It took 2 months. Near the end of April, Thu resigned and fled Vietnam. On April 30th, 1975, the South Vietnamese government surrendered to the North. The United States had truly lost the war in Vietnam. So what is the legacy? Quickly, the U.S. spent at least $150 billion to fight the war. The defense budget increased from $47 billion in 1965 to $74 billion in 1974. What did we get for it? 58,000 American casualties and 313,000 Americans suffered wounds in the war. We didn't achieve any of our objectives. In the process, 200,000 South Vietnamese army casualties and possibly 2 million South Vietnamese civilian casualties. 900,000 North Vietnamese military casualties. Remember the quote that I began with. Certainly, North Vietnamese casualties were far greater than Americans. Not necessarily most importantly, but significantly, as American prestige is in tatters. The rest of the world wonders. Imagine, for instance, if you lived in West Germany or France or Italy, and you thought the Russians might blitzkrieg across Europe. Would you think that the United States would defend you? The United States had in fact pledged itself at a certain tripwire in Europe that they would launch a nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. If we would not honor our pledge to the Vietnamese, would we keep our pledge to NATO? If we would not honor our promises to SEATO, would we honor our promises to NATO, especially if the American people were held hostage to those promises? European leaders, some of them who were rather two-faced, the French especially, on the one hand, criticized the United States for its involvement in Vietnam. Imagine that, the French complaining about that. And at the same time, when we moved out, they said the United States cannot be trusted. This led to the concern, and a rightful concern, that Europe would be Finlandized. You see, Finland had been pacified by the Russians so that Finland would not be hostile to the Soviet Union. And the Soviets would have been happy to Finlandize the rest of Europe. And this was a sincere or a serious concern for the United States in the aftermath of Vietnam. Secondly, it encouraged Soviet adventurism in Nicaragua and in Angola, and finally in Afghanistan. And as I've shared before, the fact that we spent all this money on defense, but we didn't spend it on modernizing or augmenting our nuclear arsenal, left us in a position where the Soviets gained nuclear parity. And I talked about this in my last lecture when I mentioned MAD, Mutual Assured Destruction. Same time, the Russians were able to gain naval parity with the U.S. The United States, by the end of the war, Vietnam War, had a vintage Korean War Navy. The Russians had a modern 1970s Navy with 500 nuclear submarines in their arsenal. And as well as that, it led to stagflation. The United States engaged in an increase in social spending at the same time it increased in a massive increase in defense spending, which with the rise of fuel prices would lead to runaway inflation and high unemployment in the United States in the 1970s, leading up to a recession in the early 1980s after Reagan became president. And finally, it led to the eclipse of the imperial presidency. The War Powers Act represents this, and the resignation of Nixon in disgrace represent this. Now, this is a temporary eclipse. When we talk about the imperial presidency, we talk about the idea that the presidency had expanded beyond beyond what the founders intended its powers to be. And I think there's some merit in that. And yet, at the same time, the world has become a smaller place, so that the need to react swiftly to any sort of threat to our security requires probably a more powerful president than the founding fathers intended. This eclipse of the imperial presidency really lasted for two presidents, Gerald Ford and Jimmy Carter. Neither will make it into the Hall of Fame for the American presidency. And Jimmy Carter may, along with James Buchanan, go down in history as one of the worst presidents in American history. We'll come to that in our future lecture. But until 1980, the imperial presidency for approximately 7 years was an eclipse. The American people thought they wanted a weak president and a Supreme Congress. But after Clinton's administration, they wanted a president who was larger than life. They were sick of the weakness of the Carter presidency. So this is our lecture for today. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned to this channel. Monday we'll be back.